Thank you for attending my lightning talk on In Defense of Open Source. Open source versus closed from a producer, consumer, and developer point of view. So, from a producer point of view, we're going to look at the kind of a perspective of a company choosing whether to open or close their source or close what was previously open source. So, how does open source even come to be, right? Usually there's an idea formed, right? Some developers have an idea or some sort of need they see needing to be solved, and or is pulled from a larger organization. Things like Kubernetes, which came out of Google. They built something and now they want to share it with the world. And they make it open source to get broader community buy-in and support, right? Here's the thing I made. Why don't you guys also use it? It's not really my core business, or I'd like to get some people to help me with it because I'm still in the garage. Then we get build up, right? Hype and community involvement builds up out and out of our project. We get a lot of code, pull requests, releases. The company forms. They hire staff. Now they have a CTO and a CEO, and they have developers around the world working on it. Then you start to get that kind of scaling, the cloud adoption. This is exciting, right? The business scales. You look for ways to make profit. Now you have the enterprise edition or paid for support or some sort of features behind paywalls. So I think a Portainer like this that has a really great open source product, but they have a lot of little nuances for the features that are paid for. Then you have cloud providers start to create SaaS offerings of that open source version. So all of a sudden you start seeing things like Memory Store in Google Cloud, or Swarm was very popular inside of AWS. Then there's the pivot, right? You need to grow, and you're feeling like you're not making enough money, and you start to say that you need to change the license to protect your assets. I remember talking to a HashiCorp field CTO who said that IBM was stealing their product, right? They're doing bad things, and so it's a case of you need to do something about that with the product. You're going to close source it. So I'm going to look at a couple of case studies. I'm going to look at IBM HashiCorp, MongoDB, Elastic, and Redis, because these are just ones close to home that are recent, right? I mean, at least two of these I've been pretty passionate about in the past. So in 2018, before they went public, MongoDB moved from the new Apache GPL to a newly created server-side public license. They initially proposed it to the open source initiative to make an open source license, but it was declined, and then they withdrew it in 2019. In 2021, Elastic, having seen all the popularity of the ELK and F stack, said our Elastic and Kibana ought to be closed source, and they moved from Apache to the SSPL for Elastic and Kibana. In 2023 of August, kind of a dark day for me, but HashiCorp dropped the MPL, or the Mozilla public license, for this non-open source business source license. And lastly, in 2024, Redis, or Redis Labs, switched from their open source license to a dual license BSD and SSPL. Now, is it profitable? Did these decisions allow the companies to succeed? Well, Elastic initially took a pretty big hit, and they've grown back, but they're trying to pivot themselves to be more of an AI company, and they've had a lot of layoffs in the time since. MongoDB arguably was successful. It did work. They have a product that solves a very big niche, and honestly, it's kind of a best in class of what it does when you want to do a non-cloud provider option. HashiCorp, I mean, the stock rose, but the stock also rose because IBM announced they were going to acquire them. So is that because of the license, or is that because of an acquisition? It's hard to know with Redis, because Redis is still in that kind of startup private mode, so we don't know their financials. The last time they had a funding round was $110 million of Series G in 2021. So MongoDB, they didn't do layoffs, but they did slow their growth to single digits and looked to manage out underperformers. We can kind of see some feedback on Glassdoor about that if you wanted to look it up. And they keep adding new products. They keep kind of focusing on their Atlas things, from dedicated to serverless, etc. HashiCorp, lost their founder, for which they were named for. So Mitchell Hashimoto left about the same time, shortly after August. He obviously had withdrawn a lot from the leadership at that point. And while he has made no public statements on the whole open versus closed source, he supports a lot of open source projects. He's involved in open source projects. So there's a lot of writing on the wall without any sort of verbal saying so. And then less than a year after the license changes, Elastic's also had some pretty big layoffs. What's the reaction, right? So when MongoDB changed the license in 2018, the cloud providers already had NoSQL options. So we had DynamoDB from AWS, Cosmos DB from Azure, Bigtable from GCP. And in more recent years, we've seen Apache Cassandra really take off. We have CouchDB, and FerretDB is a newer one. Elastic, they changed the license in 2021. AWS immediately made an AWS OpenSearch, but we can get marketplace options for Elastic and the other clouds. So I'm going to say they're still there. They're still very much solving a need. HashiCorp, they changed the license, and big, OpenTofu took off. And then OpenTofu is by GCP Infrastructure Manager uses OpenTofu. A lot of the cloud providers say that they're using OpenTofu behind the scenes, so they don't have to deal with licensing problems. And since Terraform is a product that really needs the cloud providers to support it, it is about creating things in other people's clouds. That's the desire of the tool. If the other clouds don't choose to support your commercial version, it's got a limited lifespan. OpenBow is a Vault competitor that's open source, but I don't see it taking off quite the same way. And Redis, as soon as they did that, their biggest contributors, they're still very small, which are people that were paid for by AWS. They're AWS employees, Azure employees, Ali Cloud employees. They all said, well, we're not going to work on your commercial tool now. And they forked over to Valkey, and now Valkey's a drop-in replacement, very popular. Microsoft released their Garnet, which is a very lightweight .NET version. Again, all to the standard of the Redis standard, not the tool. And so anybody who wants to do it, and of course, today here, we use memory store with GCP, so it's kind of one of those things where I wish Redis the best, good people, but I don't foresee them lasting that long. Let's kind of look at about the benefits and consequences of both open and closed source. So the benefits of open source is you get momentum, right? People are into it. You get community support. You have people dynamically forming user groups and building hey, come check this thing out. Third-party integrations. People add to it. You get cloud adoption. If you're open source and you're getting big, the cloud providers are happy to add it to their list of things to use. You can scale it, right? As a person who uses open source, I can scale it as big as I want. I'm not paying for that. And because a lot of people are working on it, things like vulnerabilities, so critical vulnerabilities and feedback, they get addressed by the community. There's a consequence, though. You don't own it anymore. It's out of your control. Ultimately, it'll be managed by a governing body like CNCF or the Linux Foundation. Lots of open source initiatives out there in groups. There's more competition. Whatever you made, like when Jenkins became totally open source after forking away from Hudson, a lot of different people were trying to be the new Jenkins. You have to make revenue in other ways. This can't be your core product. So you have to make revenue as services, add-ons, extended products. Arguably, Google's main source of revenue wasn't Kubernetes. Twitter's main source of revenue wasn't OpenCensus. Then there's some benefits of closed source. So when we look at the closed source side of the house, we see that I have full control. It's mine. I got it. I can charge for that solution. But I better have the best security and get fixes in place really, really fast. There's big ramifications for mistakes. And we can think of things like SolarWinds or more recently CrowdStrike. The competition that gains traction is hard to fend off, right? Because if I'm charging for my stuff, but somebody else doesn't or charges less, I'm going to lose business to them, right? I have to prove I'm the cheapest and the best of the thing that I do. I have to have a large budget for sales and promotions, right? I have to promote this thing. So closed source solutions, I'm thinking like Harness and others, really push a lot of money out there to get eyeballs to look at their product because they're closed source. You have to convince me to take time out of my schedule to try your thing out, to convince me to try to sell it to my management. And you have slow growth. You will eventually be replaced. If your product is just a closed source product, you'll eventually go away. The oldest ones out there, and I'm thinking of things like Microsoft Office or Adobe Photoshop. They've pivoted to be more than just that thing. Then there's the perspective of the consumer, right? I'm choosing whether to use an open or closed source solution as a consumer, a company that's picking things, right? So when I'm thinking about this, the question I got to ask myself is, can we evaluate the full product first? I can always verify an open source solution will meet my needs. I can try it, pivot it. Yeah, I absolutely can do that. I can sometimes do it with closed source. There's a risk of that vaporware, or, oh, that feature's not there, but we can build it. It's coming in the next release, right? Can we scale it? I damn well know I can scale an open source solution just based on my technical skills. I might have to do a little research. Closed, you definitely can scale it, but you also have to consider, what is the pricing at scale? That becomes a big ask. Are you charging me per user? Is there a graduated scale on some unit? Is it going to persist? I mean, the truth is, ultimately, all closed source will go away. It's either going to go away by acquisition, deprecation, think of the Google graveyard, market challenges or challengers. One must have, if you pick a closer solution, you must have a future migration pattern in mind. Can we extend it? The answer is always yes on open source. We have the source, we can extend it. Closed source is largely dependent on the REST APIs and the extension touch points, which can be removed. I'm thinking of Atlassian. It used to make amazing plugins and extensions to Atlassian Jira, but then they stopped making an on-prem solution, and then they restricted what they can do for the REST APIs, and a lot of those extensions went away. Is there a community for learning and sharing? More often, the community and conferences and tech write-ups and blogs and YouTube channels exist for open source projects. There are user groups for closed and certification paths. I'm thinking like Cisco certifications or Java certifications that can generate learnings, but there's definitely more on the open source side. I'm going to get more crib out of ChatGPT and Copilot. So what's the strategy for success? I suggest you start with open source. Try free and open source projects. Fail fast. Build proof of concept. Show that it works. You get your engineers, DevOps, and SREs to build and maintain until the scale becomes untenable. So we're going to host it locally until such time we're like, yeah, that's a bit big. I don't think we're going to do that. Look at cloud offerings, right? When you get to scale, migrate into cloud offerings. Or that's when, if you're an on-prem shop, you actually buy the thing. Say, I'm going to pay Redis for a Redis Enterprise hosted on-prem, things like that. Vendor agnostic choices. Do not be beholden to one company and one company's pricing. So pick a solution where I have choices. So even if I was to do things, I'm going to pick on Redis again, buy the Redis Labs Enterprise. I can also pay somebody to set up a Valkey Enterprise or Valkey supported edition. So I have choices. I'm not on one vendor. Look at AI and documentation. I need to be able to learn it. My developers need to be able to learn it. So how am I going to look at the learning? And when I pick open source solutions, I know I can learn about it easily. Build versus buy. That decision becomes a decision on staff capabilities and business needs and durability. Is not based on, I got to build it because the vendor is now changing their license model to some sort of user setting or anything else. And that's where I might pick on my friends at New Relic on their licenses, where we're like, wait a second, now how much do I owe you? And we can start to think of some of these great products we depended upon that went away. We think of like Docker Swarm that ultimately was replaced by Kubernetes because it was the bigger supported open source solution by more clouds. Sun still has Java, but it got acquired by Oracle, and I don't know too many people that pay for Oracle Java anymore. It's all OpenJDK or Zulu. Chef and Puppet, near and dear to my hearts. I love these guys. I used to have their sales engineers talking to me. They'd come into the place I worked. We had chef summits. They're gone. They couldn't succeed being a one-trick pony that was closed source. CoreOS, still have t-shirts of them. They existed. They were going to have these highly available containers that you could use. They no longer exist. They kind of lost their way to Bitnami. If you're old enough with gray hair like mine or no hair, you'll remember the great rational software with ClearCase, ClearQuest, and Rational Rose, all since gone away. Though ClearCase exists, I should say that under IBM. And few people remember that original icon, but that was the Hudson icon, which went away to Jenkins when they started to trademark and close down the source. Now, lastly, let's talk about it from a developer perspective. A closed source solution must prove it's 100% necessary and the best in its class, and after I pick it, I will look for every way to remove it or mitigate it in the future because it's just a cost against my budget. A closed source solution that is dependent upon must have high availability, fantastic support, regular updates, and provided learnings, and I'm not paying a lot extra for that. An open source solution that has become closed source has burned bridges and created ill will. It's got a stink to it. And I'm not going to take a call for them anymore. An open source project really needs to make me aware. That's maybe an Isaac thing, but you need to make me aware, and I'm going to check you out. And if I can plug into it, I'm going to. And if I can contribute back, I'm totally going to do that. And I will gladly consider purchasing support or extending it if I need that. Back in the day, that was the biggest reason people used CentOS when there's a whole lot of Linux flavors to pick from, is we could use CentOS, and then if we needed to pay for it, or we did it in the data center at the production level, we'd pay for Red Hat Enterprise Linux, because then I'd have a phone number to call and a support engineer to help at 3 in the morning when something was flaking. In summary, research. Try many open source options when you need a new system. Staff, pick a tool that your developers have buy-in. If they like what is picked, they will volunteer their time and they'll want to build it out, right? And you have the capabilities to support it. You're going to scale that thing for high availability and disaster and self-service, and you're going to have full SRE support. And if you scale beyond your capabilities, if it becomes a big deal, now you might stop at 3, but if you scale beyond that, that's where you pivot to a cloud provider. I'm thinking of kind of like an on-prem old console system we have, or an on-prem old Redis system we have. We started to look at pivoting to cloud options. So pivot to cloud option, which should be easier to migrate to other open source standards if you need to. Thank you for your time.